The glow of the monitor cast shadows across Veronica Ashford's face as the clock struck 3. She shouldn't be awake, shouldn't be watching, but insomnia had become her companion since the day her triplets were born. Silent, motionless, trapped in bodies that wouldn't obey. Tonight, she'd opened the camera feed expecting the usual stillness, her children asleep in their specialized beds, bathed in the soft amber of nightlights. Instead, she found him. Hudson, the janitor with calloused hands and worn shoes, moving through the darkened room with careful quiet. He should have been mopping the hallway 3 floors down. But there he knelt beside Theo's bed, illuminated only by the gentle glow of monitoring equipment. His fingers, rough from years of manual labor, touched her sleeping son's leg with impossible tenderness. What happened next stole the breath from her lungs. He lifted the small limb, stretching it through careful rotations she'd seen only in the rehabilitation sessions that cost more than most people's mortgages. Range of motion exercises, gentle muscle stimulation, professional, precise, deliberate. Hudson moved to Amber next, then Cole, his movements fluid and practiced in the near darkness. 20 minutes, 30. Working in silence while her children slept. Veronica's hand trembled on the desk. This man wasn't just a janitor. Those movements told the story of training, of expertise buried beneath poverty's disguise. Why was he doing this? And what else had she missed while building her empire from a penthouse office, so far removed from the ground floor, where miracles apparently happened in the dead of night? Veronica Ashford had built her empire on the principle that everything could be bought. When her triplets were born 3 years ago with cerebral palsy, she'd thrown money at the problem. The finest specialists, state-of-the-art equipment, a team of nurses and therapists rotating through shifts. But 3 years later, Theo, Amber, and Cole remained as immobile as the day they'd been born. And Veronica remained in her office 70 hours a week, attending meetings, while her children existed in rooms she visited like a tourist. Her ex-husband had left when the diagnosis came through, unable to handle children who would never fulfill his vision of fatherhood. Now it was just her 3 children, and the army of professionals she paid to love them in her place. The cameras had been her compromise with guilt. If she couldn't be there in person, she could at least watch. 12 high-definition feeds throughout the medical wing, accessible from any device. It was surveillance masquerading as involvement. She knew that, but it was all she had time to give. Hudson had appeared 6 months ago, a single father looking for steady night work. She'd barely noticed him, just another maintenance worker keeping the mansion running. Night maintenance meant he'd be invisible, gone before she woke. She hadn't thought about him until the night she saw him on the camera feed in her children's room, doing something that made her forget about sleep entirely. She'd been reviewing footage on fast forward when movement caught her eye. Hudson entering with his cleaning cart at 11:47. She'd almost skipped past it, but something made her slow to normal speed. He parked his cart and approached Theo's bed with hesitation that seemed almost reverent. Then his hand reached out, touching her son's small foot, and she watched him begin exercises she recognized from therapy sessions: ankle rotations, gentle flexion and extension, the kind of work that cost $200 per hour when certified therapists did it. He moved with confidence that contradicted his position, with knowledge that raised questions she couldn't answer. Veronica watched the entire sequence. 23 minutes. He worked on all 3 children with meticulous care, whispered things she couldn't hear. Then left, returning to his cart as if nothing extraordinary had happened. Her first instinct was anger, an employee overstepping boundaries. She reached for her phone to call security, but something stopped her. The gentleness of his movements, the fact that in 3 years she'd never seen anyone touch her children with that degree of care, the sadness on his face that translated even through grainy night vision. She closed her laptop instead of making the call. By dawn, She had a plan. By noon, she'd rearranged her schedule to make it home before midnight, for the first time in months. She positioned herself in the darkened library, adjacent to the medical wing that night. At 11:53, Hudson appeared with his cart. She watched him pause at the door, hand resting on the handle, having some internal debate. Then he disappeared inside. Veronica slipped into the observation room. Through the one-way glass, she saw him beside Theo's bed. The way his hands trembled before touching her son. The way he closed his eyes, gathering courage. Then he began the exercises with practiced precision. Not someone mimicking therapy, but someone who'd been trained. He worked in silence for 10 minutes, then began to talk. Low voice telling Theo about his day. Mundane details delivered with gentle rhythm. This was what she didn't give them. Not the therapy, but talking to them like they were people instead of patients. He moved to Amber, tone more animated. Told her about his daughter Iris, about school and field trips. He worked Amber's arms and shoulders with meticulous care. Then Cole, more tentative, more careful. Hudson understood Cole's left hip was more prone to dislocation. Somehow, he knew this. When he finished, he pulled a worn notebook from his pocket and spent 5 minutes writing, taking clinical notes, tracking their progress with professional diligence. She waited until his cart squeaked away before confronting him. At 11:57 the next night, she was sitting in the rocking chair when he entered. Hudson froze, notebook slipping from his fingers. She spoke first, voice low, told him not to leave, that she wasn't angry, that she'd been watching, that she wanted to understand why. Hudson's jaw worked. When he finally spoke, his voice was rough. He knew it was wrong, knew he was overstepping. But the apology came with depth of feeling that contradicted the words. He wasn't sorry for helping. He was sorry for getting caught, Veronica asked directly. Was he a physical therapist? The silence felt weighted. Hudson's eyes tracked to the sleeping children. When he looked back, his guard crumbled. Yes, he'd been one of the good ones, specialized in pediatric cases, built a career on hope and incremental victories. Then his wife had gotten pregnant. The accident happened on a Tuesday. A drunk driver, a red light, and his wife died on impact, 8 months pregnant. They'd saved Iris through emergency cesarean. But the trauma shattered him completely. He'd tried returning to work after 6 weeks but couldn't do it. Couldn't walk into hospitals that smelled like where his wife died. He'd had a breakdown mid-session, panic attack so severe they called paramedics. His license was suspended pending psychiatric evaluation. He never went back, just let it go and focused on surviving, on keeping Iris fed and housed. The therapy career died with his wife. He'd taken maintenance jobs, work that didn't require him to care. He'd been at the mansion for months before entering the children's room, forced to cover for another worker. He saw them receiving competent care that was somehow insufficient. The angles were wrong, the pressure inconsistent. These children needed more than motions. He'd tried to stay away but couldn't. Maybe he needed to remember who he'd been before grief hollowed him out. Helping them helped him. Veronica sat with this confession. She asked why he hadn't told her. Hudson laughed bitterly. A janitor with a suspended license claiming he was a trained therapist who'd had a breakdown. She would have fired him, called the police, and he would have lost the one stable job he'd managed to hold. He was probably going to lose it anyway now. But at least he'd help them for a few months. But Veronica surprised him. She told him to stay, to continue officially. She would hire him as primary physical therapist, pay him what he deserved, help him get his license reinstated. Hudson stared, speechless. Finally asked why. Why trust someone dishonest? Veronica stood, looking down at Theo. The answer was simple. In 6 months, no expensive specialist had achieved what Hudson had. The evidence was in the charts, in small movements and increased awareness. He'd done that with skill and dedication that couldn't be purchased. She recognized value when she saw it. And right now, the most valuable resource was standing in front of her. Hudson's resistance came wrapped in fear. His suspension wasn't simple paperwork. The process would take months, require evaluations he couldn't afford. He was barely scraping by. Supporting Iris on a janitor's salary meant every dollar counted. Veronica made an offer that rendered him speechless. She would fund the entire reinstatement. Lawyers, evaluations, whatever it took. Meanwhile, he'd work as private therapist at triple his current salary. She'd handle the liability and risk. All he had to do was show up and give her children the care he'd already been providing. Hudson's objections shifted. He talked about his daughter, about instability if Veronica changed her mind, about owing favors to rich people, about power imbalances. He talked around the real issue until Veronica interrupted. What was he really afraid of? The question landed hard. When he spoke again, barely a whisper, he said he was afraid of caring, of letting these children into the space his grief had hollowed, of failing them like he felt he'd failed his wife. He'd kept sessions brief to maintain distance, but working here daily, that distance would erode. He'd start to care, and caring was dangerous. It opened you to loss that could break you beyond repair. Veronica surprised herself by being honest. She understood fear, told him about cameras installed because being present felt too risky, about hours buried in work because being a mother to children who might never call her name felt like failure, about her ex-husband leaving because he couldn't handle loving children who wouldn't love him back as imagined. She'd stayed, but staying through absence wasn't better. She'd been a coward, hiding behind wealth and delegated care. But watching Hudson on those cameras, seeing someone give genuine care, had broken something open. She'd been forced to confront her own failure. Now she was trying to be the mother her children deserved. She couldn't do it alone. She needed someone who actually cared, someone like him. She was taking a risk too, admitting she didn't have all the answers despite having all the money. That had to count for something. Hudson looked at the children again, weighing possibilities against fears. Finally, he spoke. One condition. If he did this, she had to actually be here, not watching through cameras, here, in the room, learning the exercises, participating. Because these children didn't need money or his expertise as much as they needed their mother. A mother who saw them as people. If she couldn't commit to that, no amount of salary would make this work. The bluntness stung. But Veronica recognized truth. She took a breath and made a promise. She would be here. Every day. Not for every session, because she had a company to run. But regularly, consistently. She would learn the exercises, participate in their care. She would try to be the mother she'd been too afraid to become. Hudson studied her face, searching for sincerity. Whatever he saw was enough. He nodded, asked when they'd start. Veronica laughed. Right now, she said. Tonight, he could show her the basics. They had hours before dawn. Hudson moved to Theo's bedside and gestured for her to join him. What followed was an impromptu lesson conducted in whispers. Hudson's hands guided hers, showing proper angles for ankle rotation, gentle pressure for knee flexion, how to support the limb to prevent strain. His teaching was patient and clear. Veronica found herself absorbed. This was immediate and physical and intimate, her son's body in her hands, responding to touch that might help or hurt depending on precision. They worked through all three children, Hudson explaining subtle differences. Theo's right side stronger, requiring focus on the left. Amber's shoulder tightness needing daily stretching. Cole's hip issue meaning certain movements were off limits. There was so much she didn't know. Learning it firsthand was humbling. When they finished, dawn was breaking. Hudson gathered his things, looking exhausted, but less burdened. Veronica thanked him. Hudson paused at the door. His wife used to tell him that love was a verb, not a feeling. It required action and presence and willingness to show up even when it hurt. He'd forgotten that in his grief. But watching Veronica learn tonight, seeing her try despite fear of failure, reminded him why those words mattered. Love was what you did, not what you felt. Maybe, he said, they could both learn to do it better. The weeks that followed fell into rhythm. Veronica restructured her schedule, delegating more to her team. She came home by 8, spent an hour with Hudson and the children, learning techniques. Her hands learned different precision, learned to read subtle signals in her children's faces. Hudson was patient, correcting angles without judgment. Patricia noticed changes first. Theo's right foot showing voluntary control. Amber making sounds, trying to communicate. Cole tracking objects more consistently. The improvements were small but measurable. Permission to hope. But Veronica was changing too. Coming home earlier, eating dinner in the kitchen. Learning about her staff's lives. She'd been treating them like furniture. She instituted better policies, health care, higher salaries, actual paid time off. The mansion felt less like a museum, more like a home. Hudson brought Iris to meet the children 6 weeks in. The tiny 8-year-old settled beside Amber's bed, chattering about school and books and science projects. Amber turned her head toward Iris and smiled. A real smile. Children recognized authenticity, and Iris, with easy acceptance, gave Amber something no therapy could provide. A friend. Someone who saw past disability to the person underneath. The first conflict came when Veronica's mother visited unannounced. Lorraine found Veronica on the floor with Hudson, both working with Theo. Her expression cycled through confusion to horror. She demanded to know who this man was. Why he was touching her grandson. Veronica explained Hudson was their new physical therapist, making remarkable progress. Lorraine pulled her aside, launching into whispered tirade about liability and propriety. What would people think? Veronica felt old patterns trying to reassert, the instinct to appease, to make herself smaller. But something had shifted. She told her mother no. Hudson was staying. This wasn't her decision to make. The argument escalated. Lorraine reminded her of everything she'd done, how she'd helped with the children, supported Veronica's career, and now Veronica was trusting some stranger over her own mother. Veronica fired back that her mother never understood ambition, had settled for less, then resented anyone who wanted more. The words were cruel and true and necessary. When the fight burned out, both were in tears. The reconciliation came slowly. Lorraine admitted she was scared. Scared Veronica was making desperate decisions. Scared that trusting the wrong person could hurt the children. Veronica softened. She was scared, too. Scared she'd wasted 3 years. Scared she didn't know how to be the mother they needed. But being scared couldn't excuse not trying. Lorraine looked at her daughter as if seeing someone new. She asked about Hudson. Really asked. Veronica told her the truth. His past as therapist. The tragedy that broke him. How he worked with the children as if their progress mattered more than his paycheck. The crisis came 3 months in when a woman appeared demanding to see Hudson. Veronica found Darlene Kemp, director of the physical therapy board, waiting in the foyer. Someone had filed an anonymous complaint about Hudson practicing without a license, detailed information suggesting inside knowledge. Someone on staff had put pieces together. Darlene explained that unlicensed practice was serious, could mean criminal charges. If Hudson was providing therapy, he needed to cease immediately. She asked to speak with him directly. Veronica stalled, panic clawing at her throat. This was her fault. She'd pushed him to work openly. Darlene said she could return with law enforcement or Veronica could cooperate now. Veronica made a calculation. She told Darlene Hudson worked in maintenance, not therapy. Any therapy came from licensed professionals she could document. If someone filed a complaint suggesting otherwise, they were mistaken or malicious. Darlene didn't believe her, but couldn't prove otherwise. She left with a warning. The investigation would continue. Whatever they were doing needed to stop. Veronica called Hudson immediately. He'd known this was coming. Secrets didn't stay buried. He would quit today before this became bigger, before his presence destroyed the children's progress. Veronica told him absolutely not. She had resources. She would fix this. Hudson tried to argue, but she cut him off. This was her fault for being careless. She would handle it. He just needed to trust her. Hudson agreed to stay away for a few days while she figured it out. But if the board came back with real legal action, he was done. She hired the best medical law firm in Philadelphia. Explained the situation with careful editing. They were cautiously optimistic. Reinstatement was possible, but required psychiatric evaluation, documentation of treatment, letters of recommendation, and time. Months, possibly years. Veronica asked what it would cost to move faster. Money could smooth the process, but not eliminate it. She authorized whatever was necessary, hired investigators to find Hudson's former supervisors, paid for expedited evaluations, threw resources at the problem. But underneath, doubt whispered. What if it didn't work? The psychiatric evaluation happened a week later. Hudson emerged hollowed out. The doctor had been thorough, asked about the panic attack, his wife's death, his processing, whether he'd sought treatment. Hudson had been honest. Said he'd survived through compartmentalization, focusing on Iris and ignoring everything else. The doctor said his coping wasn't healthy. The board would want evidence of actual treatment. Therapy sessions. Proof he'd done the work. Hudson felt like a failure again. Veronica made another decision. She would pay for therapy with the best trauma specialist. Hudson protested. Too much. He didn't deserve it. Veronica said she wasn't doing this just for him, for her children who needed him, for herself, who'd learned from him, for Iris, who deserved a father who'd healed instead of just survived. The months that followed tested everyone. Hudson started therapy twice weekly with Dr. Miriam Walsh, a specialist in complex grief. The process was brutal, requiring him to excavate pain he'd been running from, to sit with his wife's death, to forgive himself. He came to sessions looking wrecked. Veronica took over therapy on those nights, her skills improving. She looked forward to these sessions, not because she was good, but because they represented real connection to her children. Theo made progress during this time, started moving his right foot on command, actual voluntary control. The specialists were cautiously optimistic. Consistent quality therapy could achieve more than previously believed. Amber found her voice, not in words, but in sounds that clearly meant something. Different vocalizations for happy, uncomfortable, wanting attention. Hudson taught Veronica to recognize the patterns. Parenting required detail, rivaling complex business deals. But the stakes were infinitely higher. Cole remained challenging. His hip issues limited safe therapy. But Hudson found creative solutions. Upper body strength, head control. Ways to celebrate Cole's progress instead of mourning limitations. Veronica learned that acceptance wasn't defeat. That loving meant meeting people where they were. 6 months in, Hudson's license review came before the board. Veronica hired a consultant, assembled evidence, letters from supervisors, documentation from Dr. Walsh confirming progress. Veronica's statement as employer, character references. The board asked tough questions about his breakdown and 3-year absence, but they acknowledged his spotless record and extenuating circumstances. Decision within 60 days. The waiting was agony. Hudson threw himself into work. Veronica checked her phone obsessively. Even Iris grew quiet and clingy, understanding more than adults credited. The decision came via certified letter that Veronica signed for. Her hands shook. The legal language was dense, but the conclusion clear. Hudson's license would be reinstated on probationary basis. He'd continue therapy another year, practice subject to random audits. But he could work. Legally. Officially. Veronica called immediately. When she told him, Hudson went silent. Then she heard tears. A man allowing himself to feel something other than grief for the first time in years. He thanked her, voice thick with emotion. Said he could never repay her. Veronica said he already had. He'd given her children progress. Medical science said was unlikely. Given her a roadmap for being present. His presence had changed everything. The shift in their relationship happened gradually, conversations extending past therapy sessions. Hudson staying after children slept, talking over tea. He told her about Iris, about single parenting pressures, about guilt. Veronica shared her failures, choosing profit over presence. They discovered common ground, both single parents rebuilding after loss, both trying to do better, stumbling through uncertainty. The conversations grew personal. Hudson talked about his wife, not just her death, but her life, learning to remember without drowning. Veronica shared things she'd never told anyone. Her father's death at 15, her empty marriage, the loneliness of success. Hudson listened without trying to fix. That witnessing felt invaluable. The kiss happened 6 weeks after reinstatement, cleaning up after therapy, reaching for the same toy. Hands collided. Instead of pulling away, they froze. Then his hand cupped her face, and her fingers twisted in his shirt, and they were kissing desperately. 10 seconds before reality crashed back. Hudson stammered apology. Inappropriate. Power dynamic. She could ruin his career. Veronica said to stop apologizing. She'd wanted it too. But complications were real. They agreed to pretend it hadn't happened. Lasted 3 days before kissing again. Midnight in the kitchen. Then after breakthrough with Theo. Each time followed by conversation about why this was a mistake, but neither could stop. The attraction was born from months of shared purpose, from seeing each other at worst and staying, from building something that mattered. Hudson made her really laugh, challenged her assumptions, saw her as person not bank account, and Veronica gave him partnership with someone who understood loss, who accepted him exactly as he was. The relationship went public by accident. Veronica's mother found them kissing in the library. Lorraine demanded explanation. Veronica told the truth. They'd been together 2 months. It was serious. She was happy. Lorraine's objections came rapid fire. Class difference, power imbalance, scandal, impact on children if it failed. Every concern was valid. Veronica had wrestled with all of them. But love required action despite fear. She wasn't asking permission. They'd figure out complications. But she wasn't walking away. Lorraine said she was reckless. Love didn't conquer all. But she hadn't seen Veronica this animated in years. If Hudson was responsible, maybe he had value. Hudson sat Iris down, explained he and Veronica were dating, cared about each other. This didn't change his love for Iris. Iris asked if they'd become family. Hudson hedged, but Veronica came in, said she hoped so, that she cared about Hudson, wanted to build something real. But relationships required time and work, honest when hard. Iris asked if she could still visit, still help. Veronica assured her absolutely. Integrating their lives proved messy and wonderful. Hudson became official primary therapist. They established boundaries, no affection during work, separate spaces, full transparency with staff. Veronica promoted her VP, stepped back from daily operations. The company didn't collapse. Hudson moved in 6 months later. Not because pushed, but because commute ate time, because Iris loved the space, because Triplets responded to consistency. They carved out Hudson's spaces: study, workshop, bedroom when needed. Not traditional, but nothing about their family was. Media discovered the relationship. Society columnist ran supposedly neutral piece, dripping with condescension. Billionaire dating therapist making 5% of her income. Questioned his motivations, implied opportunism. Response from Veronica's circle was predictable. Some distanced themselves, others offered condescending support. Associates suggested he was using her. Hudson took it harder, always aware of imbalance, now weaponized publicly. He suggested stepping back, protecting her reputation. Veronica refused, done performing for audiences. Instead of hiding, she doubled down. Gave magazine interview explaining relationship in her own words, his credentials and dedication, how he'd helped her children, falling in love with someone who saw her as person, choosing connection over convenience. Interview went viral. Tide shifted. Single parents shared stories. Medical professionals commented on quality care. Conversation evolved. Hudson read it with tears. No one had ever defended him like that. Veronica said she wasn't noble. She was selfish, found something real, and wasn't giving it up. The shift in their relationship happened gradually. Conversations extending past therapy sessions. Hudson staying after children slept, sitting in the kitchen while Veronica made tea. He told her about Iris's struggles and triumphs, about pressure of single parenting, about guilt of sometimes resenting his daughter for needing him. Veronica shared her own failures, board meetings during her children's medical crises, choosing profit over presence. They discovered common ground. Both single parents rebuilding after devastating losses, both trying to do better, stumbling through uncertainty. Hudson talked about his wife, not just her death, but her life. He was learning to remember her without drowning. Veronica shared things she'd never told anyone, about her father's death at 15, shaping her desperate need for control, about her marriage built on ambition rather than affection, about loneliness of success. Hudson listened without trying to fix, just listened. That simple witnessing felt more valuable than advice. The kiss happened 6 weeks after reinstatement, cleaning up after therapy, reaching for the same toy. Hands collided. Instead of pulling away, they froze. Air felt thick with unsaid things. Hudson apologized unnecessarily. Veronica said it was fine, voice soft. They were standing very close. Then his hand cupped her face, and her fingers twisted in his shirt, and they were kissing desperately. 10 seconds before reality crashed back. They broke apart, both breathing hard, shocked. Hudson stammered apology. This was inappropriate. He worked for her. Power dynamic made this impossible. She could fire him, ruin his career. Veronica wanted to laugh, as if she hadn't been equally complicit. She told him to stop apologizing. She'd wanted it too. But he was right about complications. They agreed to pretend it hadn't happened. Maintain professional boundaries. The agreement lasted 3 days before they were kissing again. Midnight in the kitchen, when neither could sleep. Then in the medical wing, after breakthrough with Theo. Each time followed by conversation about why this was a mistake, about power dynamics and ethics and potential disaster. But neither could stop. The attraction wasn't just physical. It was born from months of shared purpose, from seeing each other at their worst and choosing to stay. From building something that mattered more than either individually. Hudson made her laugh, really laugh, challenged her assumptions, saw her as person rather than bank account. And Veronica gave Hudson partnership with someone who understood loss, who didn't expect him to be over it or healed, who accepted him exactly as he was, broken pieces and all. The relationship went public by accident. Veronica's mother arrived unannounced, finding them kissing in the library. Lorraine's shock would have been comical under different circumstances. She demanded explanation. Veronica told the truth. They'd been seeing each other 2 months. It was serious. She was happy. Lorraine's objections came rapid fire. Class difference, power imbalance, potential scandal, impact on children if it failed, professional impropriety. Every concern was valid. Veronica had wrestled with all of them. But Hudson was right about love being a verb. It required action despite fear. She wasn't asking permission. They'd figure out complications. But she wasn't walking away. Lorraine looked at her daughter with exasperation and grudging respect. She was being reckless. Love didn't conquer all despite romance novels. Practical concerns mattered. But she hadn't seen Veronica this animated in years. If Hudson was responsible, maybe he had value beyond therapy skills. The conversation with Hudson's daughter required more delicacy. Iris had been through enough disruption in her short life. The last thing Hudson wanted was to introduce a relationship that might not last, giving his daughter another person to lose if things fell apart. But pretending nothing had changed felt dishonest. Children noticed more than adults credited. Iris had already commented on how much time her dad spent at the mansion, how much he talked about Veronica and the children, how happy he seemed lately despite the stress of license reinstatement. They decided on honesty with age-appropriate boundaries. Hudson sat Iris down and explained that he and Veronica were dating, that they cared about each other, that this didn't change his love for Iris or his role as her father. But it did mean Veronica would be around more. Iris absorbed this with the seriousness of someone older than her years. Then she asked the question that mattered most. Did this mean they might become a family with Veronica and the Triplets? Hudson hedged, unwilling to promise something uncertain. But Veronica, who'd been nervously listening from the next room, came in and gave a different answer. She said she hoped so, that she cared about Hudson and wanted to build something real. But relationships required time and work, and they needed to be honest when things were hard instead of pretending everything was perfect. Iris seemed satisfied with that, asked if she could still visit the Triplets, still help with therapy sessions. Veronica assured her absolutely. This child had become part of their lives regardless of what happened between the adults. Integrating their lives proved messy and complicated and wonderful. Hudson officially became the Triplets' primary physical therapist, properly licensed and well compensated. They established clear boundaries between his professional role and their personal relationship. No displays of affection during work hours. Separate spaces for therapy versus family time. Full transparency with other staff members to avoid gossip or resentment. Veronica restructured her work schedule even more aggressively. She promoted her VP to handle day-to-day operations, taking a step back that would have been unthinkable a year ago. She still attended major meetings and made strategic decisions, but she was no longer working 70-hour weeks. The company didn't collapse. Profits actually increased slightly, suggesting her previous exhaustion had been hurting more than helping. She discovered what Hudson had already learned through tragedy. Life was short and unpredictable. The work would always be there. The people you loved wouldn't. Hudson moved into the mansion 6 months into their relationship, not because Veronica pushed, but because the commute was eating time they could spend together, because Iris loved the big house and the grounds where she could play, because the Triplets responded better when he was consistently present rather than arriving and leaving according to schedule. They carved out a section of the mansion as Hudson's space, his study, his workshop, where he built adaptive equipment for the children, his bedroom when he needed space from the chaos. The setup wasn't traditional, but nothing about their family was traditional. The first major test came when the media discovered their relationship. A society columnist ran a piece that was supposedly neutral, but dripped with condescension. Billionaire Veronica Ashford, once married to venture capitalist Preston Caney, was now dating her children's physical therapist, a man who made 5% of her annual income and lived in her home. The piece questioned his motivations, suggested financial opportunism, implied she was being taken advantage of in a moment of vulnerability. The response from Veronica's social circle was swift and predictable. Some friends distanced themselves, uncomfortable with the class boundary crossing. Others offered condescending support that felt worse than outright criticism. A few former business associates suggested, with varying degrees of delicacy, that Hudson was probably using her for money and connections. The criticism hurt less than expected. Maybe because Veronica had spent enough time with Hudson to know his character, to understand that someone who'd spent months providing free therapy to children who weren't his own wasn't motivated primarily by money. Or maybe because her priorities had shifted so fundamentally that wealthy people's opinions no longer carried the weight they once had. Hudson took the criticism harder. He'd always been acutely aware of the power imbalance. Now it was being weaponized publicly, his relationship reduced to a gold-digger narrative by people who'd never met him. He suggested stepping back, moving out until the furor died down, protecting Veronica's reputation at the expense of their relationship. Veronica refused. She'd spent her life curating an image of success that left no room for messiness or humanity. She was done performing for an audience that would judge regardless of her choices. Instead of hiding, she doubled down. Gave an interview to a major magazine explaining her relationship in her own words, talked about Hudson's credentials and dedication, about how he'd helped her children in ways traditional medicine hadn't, about falling in love with someone who saw her as a person rather than a net worth, about choosing connection over convenience, and accepting that some people would never understand. The interview went viral. Not everyone was supportive, but the tide shifted. Other single parents reached out, sharing their own stories of finding love in unexpected places. Medical professionals commented on the importance of quality therapy and genuine care. The conversation evolved from gossip to something more substantive. Hudson read the interview with tears in his eyes. He said no one had ever defended him like that, had ever been willing to risk their reputation to validate his. Veronica told him she wasn't being noble, she was being selfish. She'd found something real after years of superficial relationships, and she wasn't giving it up to satisfy people whose opinions didn't matter. Life was too short for that kind of cowardice. A year into their relationship, Theo took his first step. It happened during a routine therapy session. Hudson was working on standing exercises, supporting Theo's weight, while encouraging him to bear down through his legs. Veronica was spotting, ready to catch if balance failed. They'd done this exercise hundreds of times with minimal progress. But today, something clicked. Theo's right foot moved forward, not a fall or a collapse, but an actual intentional step. Then another. 3 steps total before his legs gave out, and Hudson caught him. The room went silent. Then everyone was crying. Theo, confused by the emotional reaction. Hudson, overwhelmed by what they'd achieved. Veronica, seeing her son do something doctors had said was impossible. Amber and Cole watching from their beds, with expressions that suggested they understood something important had happened. Those 3 steps represented years of work, thousands of repetitions, countless hours of incremental progress so small it barely registered. But they also represented hope realized, proof that determination and skill and love could overcome limitations the medical establishment had accepted as permanent. Theo would never be typical. His mobility would always be limited, require assistance and adaptive equipment. But he would walk, would move through the world on his own terms instead of being entirely dependent. That mattered. That changed everything. The success with Theo opened doors they hadn't dared consider. Hudson proposed a more aggressive therapy regimen for all 3 children, incorporating techniques he'd been researching during his license reinstatement. Veronica agreed immediately and suggested turning one wing of the mansion into a full therapy center. Not just for her children, but for others. They could offer sliding scale services, provide care to families who couldn't afford the exclusive specialists who'd failed to help her own kids. Hudson loved the idea, but worried about logistics. Running a therapy center required administrative skills neither of them possessed. Veronica smiled and said she'd run billion-dollar real estate deals. She could handle the business side of a small nonprofit. Besides, it would give her something meaningful to focus on. A way to use her resources for more than just personal benefit. They spent months planning, consulting with other therapists, navigating licensing requirements, designing spaces that would be welcoming rather than clinical. Veronica poured money into the project with the same intensity she'd once devoted to corporate acquisitions. But this time, the return on investment wasn't measured in dollars. It was measured in children gaining mobility, in parents finding hope, in Hudson rebuilding the career grief had stolen. The Ashford Vale Pediatric Therapy Center opened 18 months after Hudson's license reinstatement, a name that announced their partnership both professional and personal. The wedding happened quietly, almost accidentally. They'd been talking about marriage in abstract terms, both wanting it eventually but cautious about timing. Then Iris asked why they didn't just get married already if they loved each other. Children, Veronica had learned, had a way of cutting through adult overcomplications. They didn't need a big production, didn't need to invite Veronica's extensive social network or make some public statement. They just needed to make official what was already true. They married in the therapy center, surrounded by the children who'd brought them together. Theo, Amber, and Cole in attendance. Iris as maid of honor, taking her role with adorable seriousness. Mrs. Chen and Patricia as witnesses. Veronica's mother dabbing at tears she claimed were allergies. It was small and imperfect, and exactly right. Veronica wore a simple dress instead of a designer gown. Hudson wore a suit he'd bought off the rack. The ceremony lasted 10 minutes, but the meaning behind those 10 minutes represented everything they'd built together. A family assembled from broken pieces. Love discovered in the least likely circumstances. Hope earned through relentless effort and refusal to give up. The vows they spoke were traditional, but the weight behind them was anything but. They'd both learned what loss felt like, what it cost to love and lose, and they were choosing to risk it again anyway. Choosing each other despite uncertainty, despite the complications and the class differences and all the reasons their relationship should have failed. Because love, as Hudson's wife had told him years ago, was a verb, and they were both finally ready to practice it. The years that followed weren't perfect. They fought about money, about parenting, about how to balance their work at the therapy center with their responsibilities at home. Hudson struggled sometimes with the wealth gap, feeling inadequate despite Veronica's constant reassurance. Veronica occasionally reverted to old patterns, trying to solve problems with money when presence was what was needed. Iris had adjustment challenges, acting out in ways that required family therapy and patience, and recognition that she'd lost her mother and nearly lost her father to grief. The triplets had setbacks, medical complications, slow progress or no progress on goals they'd hoped to meet. Running a non-profit therapy center turned out to be harder than running a corporation, full of bureaucracy and funding challenges, and the constant emotional weight of working with struggling families. But through it all, they showed up. They did the work. They chose each other every day, not because it was easy, but because it mattered. Theo learned to walk with braces and assistance, started school in an inclusive program where his intellect finally got recognition his body had obscured. Amber found her voice, not in traditional speech but in augmentative communication that let her express the sharp wit they'd always suspected she possessed. Cole's progress was slowest, but he developed his own methods of connection. Art that he created through adaptive equipment, expressions that communicated joy and frustration and love without words. Veronica discovered that success looked different than she'd imagined. It wasn't corner offices, or net worth, or social status. It was coming home to chaos and laughter. It was therapy sessions where incremental progress felt like miracles. It was Hudson falling asleep on the couch after a long day, Iris curled against him, both of them exhausted and content. It was her children growing and learning and becoming themselves despite every limitation the world tried to impose. It was building something with her partner that helped other families avoid the isolation and despair they'd both experienced. The cameras she'd installed to monitor her children from a distance gathered dust, eventually removed entirely. She didn't need surveillance anymore. She was present, really present. Not perfect, not even close, but showing up, trying, loving imperfectly but genuinely. Hudson rebuilt his career into something more fulfilling than what he'd lost. The Ashford Vale Center became known for innovative approaches to pediatric therapy, for treating families as whole units rather than just patients, for sliding scale access that made quality care available regardless of income. He published papers on techniques they'd developed, trained other therapists, became the expert he'd always had the potential to be before tragedy derailed him. And through it all, he remained the man who showed up for 3 children who weren't his because someone needed to, because love was action, because broken people could still build beautiful things if they tried. 10 years after that first night, Veronica saw him on the camera feed. They sat together on the back terrace, the same terrace where they'd first acknowledged their loneliness, where they'd begun to imagine what partnership might look like. Theo was inside practicing walking with his new braces, determined to surprise his physical education teacher with improved mobility. Amber was video chatting with friends, her communication device translating her thoughts into speech with impressive accuracy. Cole was painting, his adaptive equipment allowing him to create art that galleries had started requesting. Iris was 17 now, preparing for college, talking about studying social work or physical therapy, following in her father's footsteps in her own way. The mansion felt different than it had that first night. Smaller somehow, despite unchanged dimensions. Fuller, like a house that had finally figured out how to be a home. Veronica leaned against Hudson's shoulder, comfortable in silence they'd earned through years of showing up for each other. She thought about the woman she'd been, the one who'd believed money could solve everything, who'd watched her children through cameras because presence felt too risky, who'd been so lonely she'd forgotten what connection felt like. She was grateful to that woman for installing the cameras, for being brave enough, even accidentally, to witness what was happening under her own roof, for seeing Hudson and being curious instead of dismissive, for making the choice, however imperfectly, to be present. Hudson spoke into the quiet, voice soft with contentment. He said sometimes he still couldn't believe this was his life. That grief had somehow led to this family, to Veronica and her children, to Iris having siblings and a mother figure, to meaningful work and second chances and love he'd thought he'd never feel again. His first wife would have liked Veronica, he thought, would have appreciated her directness and her determination to do better, would have wanted him to be happy instead of just surviving. Veronica kissed his temple and said she thought his wife would be proud of the father he'd remained when everything fell apart, of the therapist he'd become again, of the family he'd helped build from scattered pieces. The children's laughter drifted from inside, their family, assembled from loss and hope, from a billionaire who'd learned that presence mattered more than presence, From a janitor who was never just a janitor. From children who'd taught them both what strength really meant. From the choice, made daily, to show up and try and love despite fear. That night 10 years ago, Veronica had watched a stranger care for her children through a camera screen. She'd seen something that shocked her, not because it was wrong, but because it was so profoundly right. Because it showed her everything she was missing while building empires from penthouse offices. That shock had changed everything, had set in motion a transformation she couldn't have predicted, had led to this moment on this terrace with this family. She wouldn't change any of it, not the struggle or the fear or the complications. Because love, she'd finally learned, wasn't perfect. It was messy and hard and required more courage than closing deals or building companies. But it was worth it. Every difficult moment, every risk, every choice to stay when leaving would have been easier. The camera that started it all was gone now. She didn't need to watch anymore. She was here, present, finally living the life she'd been too afraid to build before a janitor with broken hands and a beautiful heart showed her what she was missing.